All right. So welcome everyone. I get to stand at a lectern today. I don't get this very often. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Bruegel. I'm Jeremy Zettelmeyer, the director of Bruegel, and today we are having a joint event on CBAM and carbon pricing, forging fair paths to climate stability. And this event is co-sponsored, co-organized, joint with Rieti, the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry based in Tokyo, Japan. And I'm really delighted to be joined here by actually quite a large team from Rieti, including one of our speakers, Toshi Adimuda, who's already on stage, but most importantly for me, Shujiro Urata, who is the chairman emeritus of Rieti and was its chairman for a long time. Now, the fact that we are doing this event with Rieti is no coincidence. So, as you all know, CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU, and I think in the future of other countries too, is a critical pillar in the climate policies of the EU. It's a critical element on how the EU would like to project its climate policies abroad, but it's also an important element that is, potentially a disturbance in our international trade relations. And so there is no better partner to discuss these things than our colleagues from Japan, because they essentially share the same values on promoting the green transition, on expanding carbon pricing, but at the same time they are very much at the receiving end of CBAM too, and that's why we decided to do this event together, not to mention the fact that, of course, Urata-san and many in his team are trade experts, and their relationship with Bruegel goes back many decades. How many decades is something that the chairman of our panel, André Chapier, will explain to you later. So without further ado, let me hand over to Urata-san for a few opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction of myself and Rieti. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very happy for you and to come to this conference. As introduced, it's co-organized by Bruegel and Rieti, and I'm quite sure that very few of you know about Rieti. So let me just spend a few minutes explaining what the Rieti is all about. Rieti is a policy think tank established in 2001. And with the support of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, of the Japanese government. And it serves as a platform of knowledge that transcends central government ministries. It's not just for METI, but for other ministries as well. Our mission, Rieti's mission, is to provide evidence-based policy recommendations by leveraging both theoretical and empirical research, along with synergy from the policy field, from the government. Over the past 20 years, we have gained high regard. Maybe I'm a bit biased, but both domestically and internationally for our activities. Rieti undertakes over 60 research projects annually across 9 major research areas, including trade and investment, innovation, and so on. And we publish more than 150 articles each year and offer approximately 300 policy recommendations, suggestions to the government. Additionally, we actively organize international exchanges, holding around 80 symposia and seminars annually, with about approximately 30 of them featuring lectures of overseas experts like our director here from Bruegel. Let me just spend a bit of time explaining our relationship with Bruegel. As a leading economic think tank in Asia, Rieti has built a close corporate relationship with Bruegel. Last year, Dr. Jerome Zettelmeyer, director of Bruegel, delivered two lectures at Rieti. And of course, my old friend, Dr. Andre Sapir, sitting behind me, senior fellow at the Bruegel, has also lectured at Rieti seminars several times, including a visit last year. And let me quickly turn to the issue of climate change, which is the main theme of this organized seminar. The importance of climate change countermeasures is increasing daily. In Japan, there is a saying that the booming economy reduces various social problems. But global warming is just the opposite. It is Pandora's box, heightening global risks and creating numerous issues. Europe is now trying to prevent this Pandora's box from opening by establishing the CBAM and carbon pricing in Europe and exporting this mechanism around the world to gain more partners in preventing Pandora's box from opening. Japan has enacted the GX Promotion Act to advance green transformation and has adopted the GX Promotion Strategy to develop decarbonization technologies, to introduce carbon pricing, and to promote renewable energy as a primary power source. Additionally, the Japanese government created a fund of about 3 trillion yen, that is about 20 billion euros, last year to advance green innovation. And Rieti has been designated as the institution that is responsible for evaluating this effectiveness of this fund. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Arimura sitting behind me again, a long-time colleague from Waseda University, because I used to teach at Waseda University, and he's a leading expert in Japan on CBAM and carbon pricing. Through active discussions with Professor Arimura and all of you, the panelists, I hope we can collectively explore ways of closing this Pandora's box that I mentioned. With the leadership of the United States in climate change countermeasures being uncertain, the importance of cooperation between Europe and Asia is increasing. Since the establishment of AREA is an international organization whose name is Economic Research Institute of ASEAN East Asia. This is an international organization in Jakarta, which was set mostly by Japanese government and METI. In 2008, I have served as a senior research advisor to AREA. So I hope to serve as a bridge connecting Bruegel, Rieti, and AREA, and encouraging more Asian countries to cooperate with Europe and Japan's initiatives. I hope that today's joint symposium will further strengthen the relationship between Bruegel and Rieti and serve as a beacon of light in a world that is facing increasing confusion. Once again, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to everyone at Bruegel for setting up this very important and valuable event. Thank you very much again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chairman Urata, dear Shijuro. I'm very happy on a personal note that we are having this seminar, this joint seminar, Bruegel and Rieti. Gives me an occasion to see you again. We met more than 40 years ago. Both of us then associated with the World Bank, freshly minted PhDs. You from Stanford, me from Johns Hopkins, and they're meeting at the bank. So it's great to be here together, to have indeed this discussion. And as was said in the introduction, number of countries in the world have now introduced various forms of carbon pricing, as is the case in the European Union, as is the case in Japan, as is the case in China, as is the case of some states in the United States, and throughout the world one does see a number of carbon pricing mechanisms that have been put in place. Now, naturally, once countries or jurisdictions put in place a domestic carbon pricing, arises the issue about how to treat imports of products that incorporate carbon emissions. No jurisdiction so far had introduced such a mechanism, a border adjustment mechanism, and that was done now last year by the European Union. So when we are talking about CBAM, we are not just talking about the issue of carbon pricing. And yes, the issue of carbon pricing, and we as economists tend to advocate carbon pricing as ideally uniform carbon pricing throughout the world as the approach to decarbonization. But the issue of the treatment of imports, potentially also of exports, by some adjustment mechanism is indeed raising a lot of questions. And so it's not by accident that I'm delighted to see that the room is full. There's a lot of interest for CBAM. Again, because it has started, although the levy will only start in 2027, but the mechanism is already operating from an administrative viewpoint from 2023. So there's a lot of interest in how we in Europe are planning to operate the system, what repercussions it will have on others, on trade, but also on potential mechanisms that they will want to introduce. Will other jurisdictions do that? Will those different CBAMs that may crop up in different parts of the world, are they compatible with one another? Is there a role for the WTO? I hope it does, to try to have a multilateral approach. So far, it's essentially a unilateral approach. This is what CBAM is an EU unilateral instrument, although, as we say in the EU, it's unilateral but WTO compatible, yet to be tested. Interesting also in the European Union, in the Commission, this is not, and we see friends from DG TaxSud, CBAM is not a trade policy instrument, right? It's a carbon instrument, but it's a border instrument, and therefore it emanates from DG TaxSud with cooperation, obviously, from others. So, but this is not properly a trade policy instrument. It's a carbon instrument. It's the external side of the domestic carbon pricing. It has trade consequences, and we will talk about some of those trade consequences in a moment. So I'm delighted indeed that we will start the conversation with a presentation by our colleague Toshi from Rieti and from Waseda University. We'll look at the impact of CBAM on Japan, on Asian countries, but also discuss carbon pricing. And then we will have two neighbors of the European Union that themselves are in the process of introducing their own carbon pricing and potentially also CBAM mechanism. from Ukraine first and from the United Kingdom. And then we will turn to someone that many of us know, Ignacio Bercero, until a month ago, Director for WTO Affairs at DigiTrade, now a fellow here at Bruegel, so he will talk in his personal capacity and from the trade side, and we'll discuss the previous presentation. So we will have 3 PowerPoint presentations. We'll have 15 minutes for the first presentation and then 10 minutes for the other. Then we will engage into a discussion, and then we'll open the floor for discussion, both the floor of those that are present in the room and also those who are online, whom I invite to participate and to raise questions using the application Slido and the hashtag CBAM, CBAM. So let me first turn to you, Toshi, and for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. And it is my honor to be a speaker at this event at Bruegel. So I'm professor at Waseda University in Japan, but currently I'm actually living in Paris, visiting Paris School of Economics. And today I'm sharing my research at RIETI on CBAM and my perspective on carbon pricing in Japan. So here is a summary of EU CBAM, and I know that all of you here are so familiar, so I don't have to go through this. But I think the important part of this is that these are the products targeted for CBAM at first stage, and countries exporting in EU can get exemptions if they have domestic carbon pricing. So that's a very important part of CBAM for the climate mitigation. And so first, I will share with you some economic impacts that I analyzed at RIETI, and this is published in a discussion paper using a structural gravity model. And the second part, I would like to discuss indirect impacts of CBAM on carbon pricing discussion around the other part of the world. And so this is a result from my structural gravity model analysis with Aline Molter and Takeda and Tatiana from RIETI's. And this figure is showing how the trade will change if CBAM is introduced at 87 euros value, which was the average price of EU ETS in 2021. And for steel, I think it is evident, and this is on Chinese exports to European Union. And you can see lots of reds here, which suggests that Chinese exports to EU will be reduced if the CBAM introduced at 87 euros. So there seems to be some negative impacts on the Chinese economy. And for the chemical products, we have similar patterns. So that's one thing we can realize. And this is true for many low-income countries or middle-income countries. And this is the result for the Japanese exports to European Union, according to the structural gravity model. I have to mention that Japanese steel industries is very keen on the development of CBAM, and they have lots of concerns on this scheme. But according to the structural gravity model analysis, what we found is that actually Japanese steel industry may gain. They may be able to increase their exports to European Union because they are more efficient than the exports from low-income countries or middle-income countries. So that's what actually economic analysis suggested. So CBAM may help developed countries like US or Japan or Korea, but it may suffer, give damage to the low-income countries in terms of economics. Okay. So that's one thing we can find about economic impacts using economic models. But what about carbon pricing discussion around the world? And I would like to share with you the situation in Japan. So actually Japan has been lagging behind in terms of the carbon pricing compared to the European Union. So before CBAM, emission trading schemes, you only had regional emission trading schemes. So one in Tokyo, in the capital of Japan, and Saitama, a neighboring province. So we only had two regional ETS in Japan. And the price of permits was initially like 80 euros, but it dropped to like 4 euros. So it's very low price currently. At the nationwide, we do have carbon tax since 2012. But the level of carbon pricing is 289 yen, which is less than 2 euros. So the price impact is very limited. The government is using the tax revenue to promote renewable energy or energy efficiency, as Professor Urata mentioned. So that was a strategy that Japanese government is using. And Japanese industries did not accept the more stringent carbon pricing for many years. So that was the situation. But things have changed after the announcement of carbon neutrality by Prime Minister Suga in 2020. And then the government and METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, promoted the concept of green transformations. And as Professor Urata mentioned, that the Japanese Parliament passed this new law, Green Transformation Act, in May 2023. So it has very important components, and here I am listing up two of those. One is Japan Climate Transition Bond, so which started in 2023. So the government has started to issue the transition bond to help industries work on R&D and innovation. So it's a bit different from European style. Before government introduced nationwide ETS, first the government is helping industry. Then the government will introduce carbon pricing, actually two of them. One is emission trading scheme, and they call it GX ETS, which already started and as a voluntary basis from 23 to 25. And it says voluntary, but for firms to have access to the financial resources to the GX bond, they must be part of this. Therefore, most of the big corporations are part of this. And this GX ETS already covers 50%, more than 50% of the emissions. And this month, the Prime Minister announced that this will become mandatory in 2026. I'm sorry, 26. So I mean, we need some new law, revision of the law, but this will become mandatory in 2026. And also, we are planning to make it have auction in 2033 from the power sector. I think here we are learning from EU experience that auctions started from the power sectors. And in addition, we are introducing a carbon surcharge. It's basically a carbon tax, but they call it surcharge. So it's not legally tax. And it is actually earmarked to, return the transition bond and help energy efficiency or renewables. And this will start from 2028. So these are the Japanese carbon pricing we are moving forward. And I'm not saying that CBAM is the only reason why we had this, but CBAM helps the discussion moving forward. So yeah, that I think I can tell. I've been involved in the discussion of carbon pricing for the past 15 years in the government. And Japan is not the only country in responding to the, I think, CBAM discussion. As you can see that Turkey is discussing ETS, and many ASEAN countries are also introducing carbon pricing, and I think partly because they are exporting to European Union. And interestingly, even China, when they expanded the power ETS to the power sector, they announced it in the week that the European Union started to discuss the CBAM in the Parliament, European Parliament. So there are some, things going on between the CBAM and this. And I can say that if each country adopts carbon pricing in the G20s, then the negative impact of exports will be reduced. So this is the Chinese export to European Union. And it was red before, but it becomes green once China adopts carbon pricing. So, if the country adopts carbon pricing, its negative impacts on export to European Union will be mitigated. So that's what economic analysis suggests. So overall impacts of EU CBAM from my presentation is that actually CBAM may affect some countries, and especially low-income countries and middle-income countries. And it may help high-income countries. So it may widen the north-south gap. So I think that's one potential issue that CBAM may bring. But at the same time, CBAM will tackle the carbon leakage concern in the EU. And so that's the economic impacts. And in addition, on the carbon pricing side, European CBAM may help discussion of carbon pricing in the region without carbon pricing now. So it may help the climate mitigation policies in global sense. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toshi. This was a great presentation. Not only you respected the time and you did it shorter than the time allotted, but I think you packed a lot in your presentation. And in a sense, you already gave all the important issues. You raised already and gave answers to all the important issues. I think you showed what is the impact of the EU CBAM on Japan and on other Asian countries and beyond. And what I heard is essentially two effects, which we could call positive and negative. The positive, and in that sense, I think the EU should be pleased to see that indeed the discourse that we are taking the lead in, as we did in carbon pricing, and then in the introduction of a border mechanism, will emulate other countries to follow suit, which is good from a carbon viewpoint, which is good from the viewpoint of our commitments, the global commitments to the Paris Agreement. That's what you are showing, right? It's spreading. It's spreading in different manners. There's also one can learn from what the EU is doing, the good and the bad, and adjust one's own system to that. And this is, I would say, the positive message that comes out of your presentation. And then you also gave a warning as a more negative element, the North-South. The North-South. Yes, introducing carbon pricing. Well, it's easier for some than for others. Within countries, it's easier for the big companies than for the small ones. And globally, it's easier for the richer countries because they already have a technology today which is less dirty than what one has in some of the developing countries. So those are the two elements I think that you emphasized, which I think are crucial for the discussion and for the rest of our event. So let me turn now to first Ola from Ukraine. And first, let me thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. It was obviously not easy for you to come to Brussels. You told me you live at the moment in Western Ukraine, in Lviv, and to come to Brussels, you had to take a bus, 15 hours going to Budapest, and then you came to Brussels. We are obviously very much in sympathy for the situation in Ukraine, and again, say we are very grateful that you could come and discuss with us. You have been involved with government. You're also writing your doctoral thesis in Ukraine about carbon pricing and about CBAM. So you're very well placed, both from, let's say, an economic and intellectual viewpoint, but also from being in discussion with officials in your country to tell us what is the situation and how Ukraine is planning to adjust to this new environment on the carbon pricing. Please.
Hello, and where is the presentation? Can we turn it? Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for having me here. My name is Olya Yevsteneva. I'm a decarbonization expert from Ukraine, and as it was presented, I'm also a PhD researcher on a carbon pricing establishing in Ukraine. And actually, all the obstacles under the border, on the road, everything is manageable because we are all trying to correspond to this CBAM challenges in our country. And thanks a lot for to the previous speaker who gave us a great outline of the CBAM policies overall. And now I will try to highlight what is the CBAM for the third country, as Ukraine still the third country to the European Union. And just to highlight that that is a possibility for us in a state of chronic lack of climate mitigation policies to establish this policy, and that is very big opportunity for us because of the lack of that policies. Our energy intensity of the economy before the full-scale invasion was 2 or 3 times higher than average in the European Union, and that is a very big trade barrier now for Ukrainians, and also that is very important because now the European Union is our main trade partner. Because of the changing of the logistics after the full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine. So, yeah, as I said, that is really a big challenge for us, but the opportunity as well. Actually, what is very important to highlight that the CBAM policy is designed that way that the fair carbon price need to be paid in any case. So the first approach that fair carbon price need to be paid by the importer via the CBAM payment to the European Union budget, or the second approach via the climate mitigation policies by the exporter internally in the country. And the second approach is very different because it gave us an opportunity to allocate this fund internally in Ukraine and then make a fair redistribution to the decarbonization policies, which we have no opportunity actually to do before this CBAM. The big question is what is the price equivalent? Because we have such wording, such formulation in the CBAM regulation, and it means that the third country needs to pay not the identical price to the European Union one, but the equivalent price. And what the conditionalities of this equivalence we are now need to discuss and to approve, and also we are in a connection to the DG Taxud and energy community on this, because maybe we need to consider some economic indicators like power purchase, GDP per capita, or maybe some new business expenditures to the relocation or renovation, and so on and so forth. So the main question for us in Ukraine is this price equivalent of the carbon price, and of course establishing internal carbon pricing institutions like the ETS system and carbon tax which will fulfill the fiscal matter of this carbon tax, because now we do not have such in our economy. And actually, according to the European Union agreement with the Ukraine, we need to establish ETS in 2017, but we still have no succeed in this. And actually, the CBAM regulation push us forward to this, and we are planning to establish the pivotal, the experimental phase of ETS in 2026, when the monetary payment of the CBAM will launched. And some historical data on a carbon pricing in Ukraine. So in 2018, we have carbon pricing less than 1 hryvnia. In 2019, 10 hryvnias per ton, and from 2021 about 30 hryvnias per ton, and still it's less than €1. So that is about 0.8 euro per ton, and that is the lowest carbon tax in Europe. We have also Estonia with 2 euros, but still we have the tax rate which is like the lowest in the European Union. And also that is question, if we are talking about the carbon pricing, we need also to recognize it in 4 main dimensions: on the tax rate, tax base, tax purpose, and tax calculation method. And in every of these 4 dimensions, we have a lot of actually to do. So about the tax rate, I mentioned it above. About the tax base, we are now also discussing the implementing the energy tax directive, just to have the possibility to tax all of the fossil fuels in a moment of it extraction and importing, because now our business paying it post factum. We are declaration fulfilling, and we have no possibility to verify this and to have like a substantial carbon pricing in this matter. And also the tax purpose, as I said, so we do not have this decarbonization effect under the Ukrainian economy. Still, this carbon tax was launched in Ukraine. And also it's worth mentioning that only that entities who emits more than 500 tons per year paying that carbon tax, so only about 40% of economy covered by the carbon tax. So that is why we need to establish ETS and redesign this carbon tax as well. And today, like last year, 2023, Ukraine established the Decarbonization Fund. And it means that now Ukraine, we have a legally protected source of funds for the implementation of the energy efficiency measures. That is one state line budget, which means that before the decarbonization fund launching, this carbon tax redistributed just to the general and local budgets, and now that is all in one line. And we are in the process of establishing the secondary legislation on what how we need to distribute this fund to the business for the decarbonization policies. That is very important for us to understand if we could do this decarbonization fund a joint financial mechanism with the European Union, because just looking for a perspective, it could be a place of collecting revenues from ETS1 and ETS2, which we are trying to establish now as well. And actually, we need also to have this legally alignment with the directives, European directives on the Innovation Fund and Modernization Fund. And after this, it would be great to have this joint financial mechanism with the European Union. So our main aim, actually, from Ukraine is to recognize the CBAM policies as a great opportunity to establish our carbon taxation policies which we have like before that, and as I said, the result of it is like high energy intensity of the Ukrainian economy. And also in a process of a post-war recovery, we need to understand also that if we want to renovate steel industry, we need to use like the electricity furnaces, the hydrogen technologies, and to make them compatible with the fossil fuel technologies, like outdated technologies from the last century, we need to establish carbon pricing. And that is one of the main matters on which we are working right now. And under the preliminary estimations, this decarbonization fund, the amount of the decarbonization fund is about 1 billion of hryvnias, about $36 million. So that is quite a limited amount of money for the decarbonization policies. But of course, if we can make it a joint mechanism with the European Union, it would be great for us. And also, I want to say about 2 words about our research, which we are launching now with the Helmholtz Berlin. So we try to research the CBAM impact to the foreign trade from Ukraine, something very similar to what the previous speaker said, using the general equilibrium model. And we want to study some scenarios, for example, reference scenarios when we have no CBAM from the European Union. The second scenario, the effect of the CBAM to the Ukrainian economy, and the third scenario, if we will have the exemption. Yeah. So I think that till the end of this year, we will have some results and some sub-scenarios. Also, if we will have some climate mitigation policies in other countries, and also if CBAM will spread to the other type of goods and to other type of the emissions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That was extremely informative and very clear about the situation in Ukraine and where it's heading in the area of CBAM, and we'll come back obviously to that in the discussion. There is one word I want to put aside for the discussion later. I mean, one can discuss other stuff. From your presentation is the word equivalence. So equivalence in the CBAM is very crucial. The CBAM applies to all countries in the same manner. There's non-discrimination. And one can discuss whether there should be different treatment for different countries, for developing countries or not. But okay, at the moment, it applies in the same manner to all countries. If I'm not mistaken, there are 3 countries that are, in a sense, exempted, or to which the CBAM exactly the same system applies, because the ETS applies, and those are the EEA countries: Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And then there is Switzerland. And then there is Switzerland. Switzerland is not exactly the same. Switzerland, there is equivalence. Okay, there's equivalence. Although, again, we'll discuss that later. I'm not sure that I understood exactly how equivalence is being defined. And about non-discrimination, and since equivalence will be a major issue, there will be, I think, matters how the EU applies equivalence in a non-discriminatory manner, while at the same time engaged into bilateral discussion with countries. So how the two will be reconciled. Equivalence, which is non-discrimination, not discriminatory, but at the same time discussed in the bilateral terms, I think will be an interesting, I won't say necessarily a challenge, I think, but will be an open question that we should address, not now, but in the discussion. So let me turn to Catherine Stewart, who is the Deputy Director at the UK Treasury in charge of trade policy, and with including in her file on trade policy is indeed carbon pricing, and in particular the CBAM. And I understand that the system is now being put in place, and Catherine will tell us what the UK is doing and what are the plans for the coming months and years. Catherine?
Thank you very much. And let me start by saying a huge thanks to having me here. It's really great to have an opportunity to come and talk a bit about what the UK is doing on carbon pricing and on CBAM, but also to hear from colleagues on the panel and in the audience about other approaches and other questions that we're asking about the design and implementation of CBAM. As you mentioned, I'm Catherine Stewart. I'm the Deputy Director for Trade Policy at the UK Finance Ministry, so His Majesty's Treasury. And we work jointly with tax colleagues to design the UK CBAM, and also with our delivery colleagues in Revenue and Customs. And I am increasingly learning that it is a multi-organisation question how we go about introducing a CBAM. So we have some colleagues from UCMIS who are with us today, but also our colleagues in our Energy Security and Net Zero Department, our colleagues in our Business and Trade Department have all been absolutely critical in getting us to the point that we're at now. And I think that just underlines some of the challenges and difficult questions, but important ones that we need to engage with as we look at the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the UK. I'll say a little bit about the journey the UK has gone on to get to the point that we are now, which is consulting on the introduction and the technical details of a UK carbon border adjustment mechanism. Before I get there, let me say a little bit about carbon pricing in the UK. So the UK was part of the EU ETS, and when we left the EU, we introduced the UK ETS, and since then have gone on a journey of a range of different consultations and announcements around the way in which we progress the UK ETS. In particular, it is worth pausing on the need to reduce the overall cap of free allowances in the ETS to make sure that the path of free allowances and the path of our allowances overall meets what is necessary for us to meet our decarbonisation objectives. The reason I pause on that is to recognise that at the moment, because we haven't introduced a CBAM, free allowances are one of the tools that the UK has to tackle the problem of carbon leakage. But as we tighten the cap of our free allowances, we obviously wanted to think about what else we need to have in our toolkit to allow us to tackle this issue of carbon leakage. And so our journey on that path started last year, when we consulted on a range of different measures beyond free allowances to tackle carbon leakage. And this slide just sets out what some of those other options were, and then I'll take a moment to remind you what it is that we did announce. So we looked at a carbon border adjustment mechanism, we looked at mandatory product standards, we also looked at voluntary measures, such as voluntary product standards, labelling and green procurement as a means to help grow the market for low carbon products. And importantly, we also looked at emissions reporting. I won't say a lot about it in my presentation, but the question of measurement of emissions is certainly something that is really critical as we think about from a UK perspective, the UK CBAM, but I think also actually questions of interoperability and all of the rest of it across different unilateral measures and also international solutions to carbon leakage. Following that consultation, in December last year, we announced the UK government's intention to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism by January 2027. And that is now the journey we are on. What have we said so far about what that CBAM will include? So we've been specific about the sectors that will be included, and they look very similar to the EU sectors. but there are some differences, and I'll just pause for a second on those. So the sectors the UK CBAM will apply to include aluminium, cement, ceramics, fertiliser, glass, hydrogen and iron and steel. And I guess a prize to anybody who can spot which ones are missing in terms of the EU CBAM and which ones are additive. Essentially, glass and ceramics, the UK has included, and we have not included electricity, and that is specifically to reflect the carbon leakage risk that the UK poses relative to the EU. If I pause on electricity for a second, all of our interconnectors are with countries either in the countries in the EU ETS, essentially, so we don't face the same carbon leakage risk there as the EU does. At the point of our announcement in December, we also set out some of the design principles around the CBAM, specifically things like the scope, so that we would apply to our sectors, but also that the CBAM would apply to direct, indirect and select precursor goods. And since then, we've moved pretty quickly, in part being able to learn, I think, from some of the from the EU being ahead of us in its process. We've moved quickly to a further consultation, which gets us into the detail of the design. And I will take just a minute or two very quickly to draw attention to one or two elements of the design that I think are relevant to some of the questions that we've touched on here. The first one I want to pause on is the de minimis. So the UK has introduced, or plans to introduce and has proposed in the consultation, a de minimis of imports of under £10,000. Where over any 12-month rolling period, there will be no need to pay the CBAM charge on those goods. That's a difference from the EU design, and it's very interesting to explore some of those differences and the benefits or disbenefits of those. One of the things that we particularly wanted to do with that de minimis is partly take out SMEs from the CBAM charge in the UK, so those SME importers, but without significantly impacting the emissions that we apply the charge to. And one of the other things that's very interesting that we don't quite have the answer to yet is how does that look from the exporter's point of view, and that's something that we're trying to establish further through the consultation that we're doing at the moment. Does that de minimis, where it benefits the UK importers on whom the charge applies, does it also benefit exporters in other countries, including LDCs? I'll also draw attention just briefly to the defaults. So much like the EU, the UK is proposing to have default values, but we're proposing to keep them and to have them throughout. And that brings a challenge of what level to set those defaults at. And the consultation includes the proposal of a weighted average based on the production levels of our key trading partners. It explores the option of a plus X%, if you like, on top of that, because one of the things that we are very conscious of is the need to incentivise actual reporting. We want countries to report their emissions. That's important for us. But at the same time, we did not want to be in a situation where we put up a trade barrier that means that goods cannot be imported at all. So we've taken that position in the consultation to say that default values will always exist, but really interested in the reflections there. Verification, I'll just say very quickly, we also want to have verification of emissions. That is a complicated sort of real-world question of whether or not the organisations that can do that exist. And that's something that we're keen to get reflections on in our consultation. And then the final point I'll draw out, which I think links possibly to this point of equivalence, is that one of the things that, and this is true of the EU CBAM design as well, we want to be able to design the CBAM charge so that it is calibrating, it's self-calibrating to the emissions and the goods that are being imported to the UK, but also recognises where an explicit carbon price has been paid overseas. So where, for example, where Ukraine, for example, to introduce a carbon, an ETS and a CBAM, that price would be taken into account, and even the tax that you mentioned would be taken into account in the calculation of the charge faced as goods enter the UK. And those are all sort of design features that we've consciously thought about and introduced as a means to limit the negative impacts on trade and improve the way in which the charge calibrates to prices elsewhere. And then I guess a final point, because I'm very conscious of time, is just to circle back to what is it that we're trying to do, and I think to touch on Toshi, your analysis, which looks at the difference when the difference in the impact when a country has a carbon price and otherwise. And of course, the point of the CBAM is to deal with the risk of carbon leakage from the UK. That's really important for us. What we are really determined not to do is to decarbonise by shifting our emissions overseas. But if we also have that secondary benefit of, I mean, the EU CBAM is much larger and a much bigger impact, but if the UK being part of that story of having a CBAM too can then encourage other countries to introduce carbon pricing, to introduce CBAMs, and that has the positive benefit of delivering decarbonisation and helping us globally to meet our decarbonisation objectives at the same time as having lesser impact on trade and trade flows, that feels like a very good place to be. I shall stop there, aside from just reminding you all that our consultation is live at the moment. It's open until the 13th of June. So if you haven't, please do have a look at it. Please do reflect on the policies that we've proposed. We really want to hear what people think about whether we're on the right track and the design of the UK CBAM, and to make sure that when we move on to the next stage, which includes our legislative stage, we are engaging with our international partners, we are hearing their views, and we are thinking about how to build that into the design of the policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. I think that was, again, very, very clear. I think it was good that you put that slide at the end to say where you are in the consultation and what is the timeline for the introduction of the UK CBAM, which I understand is timed to be corresponding to the EU CBAM, more or less. One element that I try to pick on each presentation, you know, what drew my attention is that by discussing the work that you are doing in the UK, which is not unlike naturally the work that took place already in the past, but still ongoing in the EU, since this is still work in progress in the EU as well, is the administrative element. That is something that one often hears about CBAM. Yes, it may or may not be WTO compatible. Personally, I think that if it went to a judge to dispute settlement at the WTO, I think it will be found to be compatible, and one can discuss with whatever article of the GATT. So I would feel pretty confident from what I've read and discussed with different colleagues, not only economists but legal scholars. I think a question mark then will come on the details. So the principle, yes, it's about climate, and it's clearly not a trade policy measure. It's clearly a climate measure with trade consequences. It's not the other way around. It's not a trade measure that you can say, well, by the way, it has also does something for climate. It is a climate measure. I think there's no doubt about that. Not just sort of in the narrative, but in the measure. But okay, again, it's the first one, and potentially, I think some question could arise as to the fine print. Some of the elements talk about equivalency before other elements, and I think one issue that could also crop up as a potential matter is how cumbersome this is, and whether cumbersome means non-tariff barrier someplace. Is this implemented in a way that, in a sense, turns out to be discriminatory, to be protectionist? And again, I think that's the fine print, and some of the fine print is not available as yet. But I think your presentation, although not using the same terms, sort of raise, in a sense, that kind of, it's a complicated system. And maybe it needs to be complicated, but maybe it can be made a bit simpler. And again, one has to see that now we have our CBAM, but then there'll be a UK CBAM, then be a Japanese CBAM, then be CBAM, CBAMs, and the complication will come also from the multiplication of all of this. So it's going to be messy. And so it may be, even if it's compatible, it may be very messy, and maybe messy for all of us. Not just the EU as an importer, the EU as also as an exporter. And so we have to be mindful of that. So this is a natural place to turn to Ignacio. As I said, Ignacio has just retired from being a director in DG Trade, overseeing all the multilateral issues, but also sort of the brain behind the discussions and the reflection, the strategic discussion in DG Trade. I want, at this stage, share some of my personal views on some of those matters and what I know is going on within the Commission about those matters between the different DGs. I may or may not choose to do that at a later point, but I think Ignacio is really very, very well placed to give us his personal view based on his experience. Ignacio, what is your reaction to what you have heard?
Thanks a lot, André, and it's a real pleasure to have the possibility to give you some reflections about the implementation of CBAM. Let me start by clarifying that I have not yet joined Bruegel. I hope I will, but I have not yet joined. Now, my basic argument is going to be that the European Union has a strong interest in reinforcing cooperation with third countries as we are moving towards the implementation phase of CBAM, not only to reduce potential trade tensions, but also to make sure that CBAM is effective as an instrument to achieve carbon leakage. Because the more that the CBAM becomes a purely isolated European Union initiative, which is not really followed up by others, the more that there are going to be questions about the effectiveness of CBAM, where it is due to carbon reshuffling, where it is due to impact on downstream sectors, where it is due to the issue of export competitiveness. So I think there's a strong interest from my point of view of the European Union to reinforcing at this point in time the cooperation with third countries. And I would basically see three main areas on which this cooperation should focus. One, I think you just mentioned it, André, is the whole question about how to limit unnecessary administrative costs of CBAM. The second one, which is probably the more challenging, is how to promote cooperation on decarbonization by the main producing countries of CBAM products. And the third one is how to deal with the impact of CBAM on some vulnerable to developing countries. So I think those are the three areas in which I think more work would need to be done by the European Union. I mean, we have already been very much engaged in dialogue with third countries in many different fora, but my sense is that this is a dialogue that should be intensified. And as we are looking into a number of decisions relating to the implementation of CBAM, we should also be looking into these different matters. And I insist again, I'm just going to be offering you not a DG trade perspective, a personal perspective. Now, first on the question of reducing the administrative costs. Now, I think it's important to bear in mind that the CBAM charge is going to be extremely low, at least until 2030. I mean, that is the first time that there's going to be a significant reduction of free allowances. So therefore, between 2027 and 2030, the main cost of CBAM is going to be the administrative cost. The cost of actually making a declaration of both direct and indirect carbon emitted emissions. Now, I think what we need to be looking into in which cases this can be a problem. This can be an obstacle for exporters into the European Union. I mean, you have already mentioned the issue of small and medium enterprises. Small companies that might be falling within the products which are covered under the CBAM regulation, or we may be exporting to the European Union in small quantities, what I think is what I call the nut and bolts issue. And how do you actually deal with those types of administrative costs? But I think also, and down coming into this north-south dimension, I mean, the reality is that very, very few developing countries, and indeed not many developed countries either, already have introduced a carbon price, which means that for companies in those countries exporting into the EU, unless they happen to be rather big companies, establishing a system to monitor, report, and verify carbon prices can become a significant cost. So how to deal with those issues, also taking into account the perspective that you might actually see not one, but several CBAM measures being adopted. So I think there are three issues that, in my view, one should consider. One which I think is already happening, it is the whole question about methodologies for the accounting of embedded carbon emissions. How to try as much as possible that they are harmonized or at least compatible to methodologies. I mean, I understand that this is beginning to be discussed in the framework of the OECD, in the framework of the G7 Inclusive Climate Club. There may even be discussions about this issue in the WTO, but the more that you actually develop methodologies for accounting of carbon emissions which are at least compatible, it may not always be possible to have it harmonized. I mean, I think I understood that the UK CBAM would include Scope 2 emissions. Is that okay? Which is not the case for some products in the EU, so there might be some cases that for objective reasons you cannot have a fully harmonized carbon accounting, but this is something which I think is going to be very important in terms of reducing costs. Secondly, but I know that Taxud is already reflecting about that, is the whole question about how to limit impact on the small and medium enterprises, and I think that's something I understand there is already some reflection taking place. Now, the third issue is more difficult, but I just wanted to put this idea for consideration. I mean, as I said, until 2030, the cost of CBAM as a charge is going to be very small. Now, the current philosophy of CBAM is that in order to incentivize reporting, the default value should be a penalizing the default value. I think this is something that we might want to evaluate, at least on a transitional basis, taking into account that for a number of countries, the introduction of a monitoring reporting system would take time, at least on a transitional basis, where the default value need to be a penalizing one. Now, what should be the appropriate default value? That's a different question. I understand from what you said that there are also consultations now ongoing in the UK about what would be the appropriate default value, but that's something which I think one should also be thinking about. And as I said, I'm not talking about legality, I'm just simply talking about efficiency, and also taking into account that, as I said, introducing a carbon price, introducing a monitoring and reporting system for certain countries, that's something that may need time. Now, the second issue is by far the most complicated one, which is the whole question about how to try to coordinate or how to take into account the carbon reduction actions which have been taking place in the exporting country. Now, the approach on CBAM, I think, is sound. I mean, as far as I understand, the linkage issue with Switzerland, but some may want to comment on that. I mean, the reason why Switzerland does not pay CBAM is because the design of the ETS in Switzerland is essentially the same as that in the European Union. I think they are legally committed to maintain an ETS system which is essentially comparable to that of the European Union, and therefore the carbon price which is actually paid by producers in CBAM is the same carbon price which is paid by producers in the European Union. So that's the reason, which I think is perfectly defendable under the WTO, why you do not actually apply the CBAM in the case of Switzerland. Now, for other countries that have a carbon price, what you have is a discount. So that to avoid that third countries pay a higher effective carbon price than domestic producers, any price which has been paid in the country of origin is discounted when it comes to the application of CBAM. Now, the exact methodologies to do that still needs to be determined. I think that's one of the issues that I understand Taxud needs to be looking in practice how this is going to be done, but that is the principle which applies. Now, the argument is sometimes made that by doing so, we are somehow unfairly giving better treatment to countries that have introduced a carbon price. And it is true, you could argue, well, it is true. You could argue that whether you have achieved a certain level of embedded emissions through a carbon price, through a regulation, or even through a subsidy, does not make a difference in terms of the issue of carbon leakage. But of course, the impact on the producer is fundamentally different. I mean, if you were actually going to I mean, just imagine 3 companies. A company which is actually, 3 companies that have the same level of carbon embedded emissions, that have made an investment to reduce their carbon emissions. And company A has done so in order to pay a lesser carbon price. Therefore, if the carbon price is the same as the one which applies in the European Union, it is exempted from CBAM. Company B has the same level of carbon emitted emissions because it has to comply with the maximum emission standard under the regulation which has been adopted in the country of origin. But that company does not have to pay for their emissions, whereas the company under country A, they still have to be paying for their emissions, even if they have actually made the same investment. And if you happen to have, of course, a subsidy, which actually subsidizes your investment, then basically you are not paying for the reduction of emissions. This is actually taken up by the government. So in my view, what we are doing is clearly a non-discriminatory approach. Now, what this shows, however, is that there can be many, many different ways to achieve a certain carbon objective. And I think there will be a strong interest of the European Union to engage in discussions with other producing countries to explore what are possible ways of having compatible patterns towards decarbonization. Because carbon pricing schemes are going to be different. They're going to be different in their design. They're going to be different in the levels. There are going to be different variations in the extent to which free allowances are allowed or not. And this is very complex to make a decision without having engaged in a dialogue involving as many producing countries as possible. Now, the question is where this dialogue should take place. I mean, there's some potential for that, but we can come back if you want to that.
I want to, because I'm looking at the watch, yes, and I want to have enough time for the discussion. I want to give you 1 more minute, Ignacio,
okay,
on your third point, on the developing countries.
The third point is what you also need to be aware is that there are some countries which are low-income countries or low-middle-income countries, which happens to be the case of Ukraine, that can be significantly impacted by CBAM, even if they are not major producers globally, or they are not significant emitters. Now, the most clear case is Mozambique, which actually basically 22% of their total exports is aluminium exports to the European Union, and it's the least developed country. If you look into Ukraine, I think 7.8% of Ukrainian exports are exports of CBAM products to the European Union. Egypt is also quite high, almost 7%. So these are countries which clearly can be significantly impacted by CBAM. Some have argued that they should be exempted from CBAM. I don't think that that's legally possible, quite frankly. But I think these are the cases in which I think it's going to be particularly important to focus your cooperation efforts to ensure that you help those countries in the process of decarbonization so that the overall impact of CBAM in their economy is not a negative one. But I think it's much more a question about the support that you can produce to provide to those countries to assist in their decarbonization.
Thank you, Ignacio. Let me just add 1 point, and then we'll open the floor for discussion on your last point. Some people, I've not heard that many inside the EU or other countries, including the UK. I don't know what is the situation in the UK, but among the countries that are introducing a CBAM, but among the developing countries, what I hear is the following. Yes, to speak of the EU CBAM, the EU CBAM says explicitly it's non-discriminatory. Okay, and it was felt if you have to be WTO compatible, Article 1 of the GATT, non-discrimination. So, first, that's the minimum you should meet in order to be compatible, is to meet Article 1, non-discrimination. So, yes, no differential treatment. But there are obviously possibilities in the WTO to have exemptions from that. One could have a waiver. So countries could agree. Why not? I mean, everything is possible. Right? So you cannot do it unilaterally, but the membership could agree, especially if, and I don't want to, that we discuss that. No, I mean, I want to come back after we discuss that with the room, but it's a possibility, right? And it's not to be excluded that some developing countries would raise that. Okay, sure, CBAM is good, and we go along this because we indeed are signatories of the Paris Agreement, and this is about decarbonization. Great, but there's also a development dimension into this matter, and therefore one needs to have a development instrument. One can have development instrument in the form of financial assistance, development assistance. Yes, that's one. But one could imagine, as the WTO already does, that the trade rules, there is special and differential treatment. And I expect that this will come on the table. So I think that issue is not going to go away. What I think is to be discussed, and I think that I would like to hear also in the discussion, is what instrument should the EU, in bilateral way or in multilateral manner, consider to deal with the fact that there are some countries, and we have heard about Ukraine, we have heard about Mozambique, but there are other countries that are lower income countries that will be affected not just by the EU but by the multiplication of the CBAMs by the UK, by Japan, by others. So let me turn to the room for questions. Yes, I see one question there. Yes, please. I will just ask you to introduce yourself and to ask a question.
Thank you very much for the event. My name is Andrej Stančík. I'm from Energy Traders Europe. I have a question regarding the UK and applying CBAM to electricity, especially imports from the UK, because the effect could be that European consumers would have higher electricity bills, but as well it goes against the principle of CBAM because it also could mean less renewable energy coming to Europe from UK, especially wind farms. So my question is, how do you see this problem being resolved?
Thanks. Let's take a few questions. Another question? Jeremy?
Maybe to the entire panel, but particularly to Ignacio, what is the right way of quote-unquote compensating developing countries like Mozambique without negating or undoing the incentives that are supposed to be imparted by CBAM? So obviously we cannot just return what we get from Mozambique to Mozambique, otherwise we're missing the point, right?
Yes, in the first row there. In the first row. Yes.
Thanks. Claes Bengtsson from DG Taxud. I had one suggestion, question on the issue of how to model the effects of CBAM, and it's also a little bit related to what we're discussing about the potential effect of CBAM on third countries more in general, which is the CBAM is part of a package where the own allowances, the free allowances in Europe will be phased out completely symmetrically with the introduction of CBAM. So I think when you model the effect of CBAM, it's important that you model the effect of both these things at the same time in a block and not just in isolation model what happens with the introduction of CBAM, because they do come in a pair, and they come in a pair exactly for some of the WTO reasons. So that's just one observation, and I think it does have an impact on when we think of the effects, for instance, of a producer in Mozambique. Because before we introduced CBAM, he was able to compete in Europe and sell into Europe, competing with European producers that didn't pay ETS. After the introduction of paid allowances and CBAM, this will be exactly the same equation. That's the whole philosophy of having the level playing field. I'm not saying there's no effects. I'm not saying that the issue should be ignored, but I think it's important to keep in mind when we think about the proportions of the issue we are confronted with, that this thing happens in a tandem. Now, the other point is in relation to the issue of potential trade frictions, because I agree there's an issue of whether or not things are WTO compatible, but the real big issue to my mind in terms of avoiding the trade frictions is on the administrative side of this equation. Since Paris, we have agreed that each country have to develop their own toolbox on how to reach the emission goals, and that is a giant challenge to our trade system. It is a giant challenge of having 1,000 different flowers bloom, and one of the things where we can make a very big effort in reducing the resulting frictions, because I think it will be an illusion to think that all the frictions can go away, is exactly on how do we agree on what we measure. Podesta, when he introduced his the new task force in a speech a couple of weeks ago, said that also for the US it's really important that we start to focus what is in the products that crosses the borders. And this is about how we measure how much carbon is in the borders and is in the products. And focusing on how we measure that in a coordinated way is, to my mind, one of the most important elements of reducing the frictions, not the WTO debate. Thanks.
Thanks. Just one parenthesis. I'll take one more question, then come back to the panel. You just answered one of the top questions from Slido that someone asked and others supported, which says that the basic policy is to impose same level of quote-unquote tax on non-EU products as EU products with EU ETS, then why the specific export country lose the competitiveness? So this is what you have basically responded, is that at the same time as the carbon price is increasing by reducing the allowances, the free allowances in the EU for EU-based producers, there is the introduction of the CBAM. Okay, so this is something very very important. The two go hand in hand, and so in that sense, the response that you gave is that the carbon price that domestic, in this case EU, but the same will apply obviously in the UK and others, that the EU producers or EU-based producers are facing is the same as the carbon price that the exporters into the EU are facing. So they're increasing in tandem, and they're increasing gradually, and as you said, mostly after 2030. So we are removing sort of allowance. I mean, that is something very, very important. At the moment, many producers in the EU have received free allowances. So they're not paying for they're not paying, just like exporters to the EU are not paying, and that will change gradually, starting in 27. One more question. Yes, in the front row,
thank you very much.
and then go back to the panel.
Stefan Moritz, Secretary General of European Entrepreneurs, the European Confederation of SME Associations. We don't have only a problem with importing countries that might have a disadvantage, but we have also a problem with European producers, especially in the field of iron and steel. Iron and steel, different from the other product groups, is a raw material in this sense. And European producers of heat pumps, windmills, tablespoons and washing machines are disadvantaged in this sense because then the iron is, the raw material is taxed, but the final product not.
What is your question, please? What is your question?
How do we treat that?
Okay.
I mean, we must give an answer to these producers.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So let me go back to the panelists in the same order as their presentation. You please feel free to pick from the questions that were raised, and you can see also on the screen some of the questions besides the question that I already indicated from Slido. You please feel free to pick one or two of those questions and give your answers. Please.
Okay, so I'll start. I saw that one question on the Japanese ETS from 2026. Is there any auction or not? Actually, the design will be discussed. So it's not clear if we have auction on 2026 when it becomes mandatory. I think that's something we will be discussing from now on. And the another thing that I couldn't mention in my presentation, I think the administrative part of the EU CBAM is really a big issue. For example, in Japan, we have a Tokyo ETS in addition to the carbon tax nationwide. Can EU account for the carbon pricing for Tokyo ETS in addition to carbon tax to exempt the price to be paid? I don't know, this is the same question to the UK system. So there are lots of issues to be discussed, I mean, before the EU can implement a fair CBAM.
Okay. Ola, is there a point you would want to take?
Yes, actually, now we are in a very initial stage of ETS creating. We need to establish a cap of the emissions, which is very hard to do during the war, because we have no complete information from all of the installations. And of course, in our calculations, we will see how to mitigate these effects when the free allowances from 2000 till 2034 would be fully declined, and CBAM will be in a fully force. How to mitigate this sharp of the carbon pricing to avoid the shock of carbon pricing? But of course, that is a question of calculations, and we have no clear answer here.
Thanks, Katrin. There were some UK specific questions.
Let me try and tackle that first question on electricity. So I think if I've understood properly, the question relates to the default values that will apply in the EU CBAM and imports of UK electricity to the EU, if I've understood that properly, but maybe we can pick up afterwards if not. It is an issue that we are conscious of, and one that we've raised, the UK has raised with the EU, and I understand the Commissioner engaged in that as an issue, as part of something that they need to look at and think about how the default value reflects the level of renewable energy that is being exported. I don't have a specific answer on what the solution is, but it is something that we're conscious of in life too. Hopefully that helps, but we can certainly pick up afterwards. I also just want to pick up on this point from our colleagues at TaxHood on measurement and the importance of measurement as the way forward. I completely agree with that. I think the UK says regularly that we're taking unilateral action because taking international action is difficult and takes time, and it certainly feels like one of the first things that we need to think about is how do we do measurement in a way that is compatible, at least across different systems. And as you mentioned, I think you mentioned the OECD and IFCMA, who are looking at those questions, but also would encourage the Climate Club to be looking at those sorts of issues too. And then the final point I'll just touch on is there was a question on here about resource shuffling. I don't have a perfect answer, but I do want to draw attention to within the UK's consultation, we have looked in part to try to deal with that sort of issue where we take into account overseas carbon prices by saying that the level of free allowances, for example, that are included in the calculation of the carbon price paid should be averaged out to try and avoid the situation where a trade partner can say all of our free allowances were on those goods, so please don't deduct that from the carbon price we paid for goods imported to the UK, and so you end up with a larger deduction from the UK CBAM. So we're starting to tackle some of that in the consultation, and it's very much an issue that we'd welcome views on. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Ignacio, if you take a couple of the trade questions.
No, I think I would like to focus primarily on this development issue, because I think it's probably the more critical issue in terms of the legitimacy, international acceptability of CBAM. I mean, I think basically, in my view, there are three issues that could be done. Now, if you are looking into a situation of a least developed country or a low middle income country which is highly dependent of the European market, like is the case of Ukraine, but it's also the case to a lesser extent a country like Egypt, I don't think exemptions are the right way to go. By the way, I think they are very doubtful in terms of the WTO compatibility. I don't want to enter into legalistic discussions, but the scope of the special and differential treatment in WTO is very contested for those type of situations. So I think the right response to those type of situations is through the financial support that you should be ready to provide to help those countries in decarbonizing those sectors, or more generally in decarbonizing their economies. I think for me, that is the right tool for that type of situation. If you are looking more broadly into other developing countries that might not necessarily be in this situation, I think you need to accept that introducing the carbon price, introducing the monitoring, reporting, verification system may take time. And that's what I think you should be ready to look a little bit more openly into the question about what kind of default values you apply, at least until the moment when CBAM starts to bite, which is 2030. And then it's something which is really much more general. It's not only developing countries. I mean, what is very clear is that it's going to be a very difficult job for the Commission to decide how to take into account the measures that are being taken in the exporting country. There are different levels of carbon pricing. There are measures which may only apply at the regional level. Some countries, like Brazil, we are ready to introduce a carbon price domestically, but as part of this carbon price, there's going to be an offset mechanism to tackle deforestation. It is something that should be recognized or not. Some countries may say we are ready to introduce a carbon price, but inevitably our price is going to be significantly lowered to the one which applies in the European Union. Is there some way for us to be able to collect the revenues for the difference? I mean, those sort of issues are going to be very complicated issues, which in my view, the only way to make at the end of the day a good decision is going to have a forum where you can discuss with all the key producing countries the challenges, hopefully to try to come to agreements. You may come to agreements in some sectors, not in others, or even if you don't come to agreements, to have enough of an effort of discussion to identify what is the proper way forward. But this is not only for developing countries, that is also for Japan, that is also for the United States or the UK. I think this is something where you will really need to have this possibility of looking into all these issues in an open manner.
Thank you. I think that's a very wise set of remarks, as were all of the panelists' presentations. I think this was a very rich discussion. There were a lot of questions on Slido that we were not able to respond to, and I think that shows that indeed CBAM. Both carbon pricing and CBAM are really live issues and will become more and more. There's tremendous amount of interest for this. So I think that should encourage us to have other discussions of this sort at Bruegel. Again, I want to thank all 4 panelists for really a wonderful presentation of all the issues. I want to thank again Rieti for the cooperation, and let me thank everyone in the room and everyone online for their attention. Thank you very much.